A Navy SEAL buried his wife alone until her German Shepherd refused to leave the snow-covered grave. The German Shepherd had been there every morning for 3 weeks. She didn't bark. She didn't wander. She walked 2 miles from the Callaway property through the November snow before first light, and she stood on the frozen ground above the grave until the cold became too much even for her. And then she turned around and walked back. Margaret Callaway had followed her twice. The 3rd time, she'd let the dog go alone. The 4th time, she'd stopped watching from the window. By the 3rd week, she had simply accepted that this was what the dog did now, the way some things become true without ever being decided. She didn't call anyone because she didn't know who to call. The husband was somewhere the army couldn't reach him. Now he was home. And the dog had stopped coming back. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. We read every single comment. This one is going to matter. Cole Merritt had driven 14 hours straight from the airport at Baltimore after the duty officer at the base finally reached him with the kind of news that requires someone to sit down and then cannot be sat down for. He'd flown home on a bereavement flight he barely remembered boarding. He'd driven from Baltimore to the house in Western Virginia that he and Rachel had bought 3 years ago specifically because it had a field behind it, and Rachel had wanted a field. He pulled into the gravel drive at 2:30 in the morning and sat in the truck for 40 minutes before he went inside. The house was wrong. He understood that in the first 3 seconds, not from anything he could name, but from the specific texture of a space where someone's presence has been removed. Rachel's coat was not on the hook by the door. Her boots were not on the mat. The kitchen table had 3 chairs instead of 4, which was wrong because Rachel had found that 4th chair at an estate sale in 2021 and had been unreasonably attached to it. And now it was gone, and Cole stood in the kitchen at 2:40 in the morning, not understanding what he was looking at. He moved through the house slowly. The bedroom still held faint traces of her. The particular way she'd arranged the books on the nightstand, a scarf he found folded on the top shelf of the closet, a handwriting he'd know anywhere on the inside cover of a novel she'd been reading. But her jewelry was gone. The photographs of her family that had been on the hallway credenza were gone. The credenza itself was gone. Someone had come through here and made decisions about what belonged where, and those decisions had not been made by Cole. He stood in the doorway of the room they had shared for the 3 years they'd actually managed to live in the same house, counting all the deployments, all the workups, all the operational rotations. It had not been many years, and he understood for the first time, in his body rather than in his mind, that she was not here and was not going to be. He had known this fact since the duty officer had told him. He had known it on the plane and in the rental car and in the truck in the driveway for 40 minutes. He had not yet understood it the way you understand something that cannot be undone. He was 38 years old and had spent the last 16 years in the United States Navy, the last 11 of them in naval special warfare. He was 6 feet and 1 inch tall, 190 pounds of the particular physicality that SEAL training produces and sustained operational service maintains. Controlled, efficient, carrying no mass that didn't serve a purpose. His hair was dark and cut close. His hands were large and had known exactly what to do in places that do not appear in any news coverage, and they hung at his sides in the kitchen of his own house, not knowing what to do at all. His eyes were a dark, steady brown that his teammates had described as the color of patience. They had not meant it as a compliment. Exactly. They meant it as a statement of fact about a man who could wait out almost any situation without revealing a single thing he was thinking. Right now there was nothing to wait out. There was only the house and the missing chair and the coat, hook, with nothing on it. He'd reached Preston Hale 3 times in the last 6 weeks. Preston was Rachel's older brother, 46, an estate attorney in Charlottesville, a man whose handshakes were practiced and whose condolences, when Cole had finally gotten through to him, had sounded like something he'd rehearsed and filed under the right emotional frequency. Preston had handled everything, he'd said. The funeral had been small, out of respect for Rachel's wishes for privacy. The grave was in Calverton, at a rural churchyard the Hale family had used for 3 generations. He'd send the address. He hadn't sent it. Cole had called twice more. Preston had not answered. He slept 3 hours in the house and then drove to the Calloway property, because Margaret Calloway was the neighbor who'd had Sable since it happened, and Cole needed the dog. He didn't analyze why. He needed her the way you sometimes need the one thing in a room that knew the person before they were gone. Margaret Calloway was 68 and had the manner of a woman who had learned, from a long life of things going wrong in various ways, that the best thing you can do for someone in grief is tell them the truth and give them something warm to hold. She opened the door before Cole knocked. She told him she was sorry. She told him she'd been with Rachel at the end. She'd been the one to find her. When Sable had come to the Calloway door and would not stop barking, and she would tell him everything he wanted to know in whatever order he needed it. But first she handed him a cup of coffee, and then she told him about the mornings. Sable appeared from the hallway before Margaret finished the sentence. She moved into the room the way she always moved, with the particular self-possession of a dog who had been trained to be calm in difficult environments, and she stopped in front of Cole and looked at him. She was 5 years old, 74 pounds, a German shepherd with a coat that ran from deep sable along her spine to a lighter tan at her chest and paws. One of her ears had been folded slightly at the tip since birth, which gave her a permanently questioning expression. Rachel had found her through a veteran's emotional support program when Cole was on his 3rd deployment. She had been trained to recognize anxiety responses, to interrupt nightmares, to provide the specific kind of presence that people who carry invisible weight sometimes need more than anything else. She had provided it for Rachel. Now she stood in front of Cole, and she looked at him with dark amber eyes, and then she pressed her head against his knee and held it there. Cole put his hand on her neck. He did not speak. Neither did Margaret for a full minute. Then Sable stepped back, turned and walked to the front door. She sat down. She looked back at Cole. "She does this," Margaret said. "She's been doing it every morning. Where does she go?" Margaret told him about the walks, the 2 miles, the route through the Calloway East pasture and along the old fence line, and then down through the hollow where the Hale family churchyard sat behind its iron gate, half hidden by November trees. She'd followed once. She'd seen where the dog went. Cole set down the coffee cup. He followed Sable out of Margaret's door and across the field in the November cold. A cold that had the particular sharpness of the Blue Ridge in late autumn, thin and bright, the kind that makes the world smaller and quieter at the edges. The sky had gone the flat white of a day that means snow by afternoon. The grass crackled underfoot where the frost had not released since dawn, and his breath came out visible in small, even clouds, and the dog moved ahead of him in the way she had moved, that controlled, self-possessed stride, ears slightly forward, body language communicating awareness without alarm. He had not been in these fields before. He and Rachel had bought the house in spring, and his leave between deployments had been measured in long weekends, enough to hang a screen door and paint the porch railing and sit in the backyard in the summer dark talking about what they would do with the field when time permitted. Time had not permitted. He was walking through it now behind a dog in November for the first time, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you cannot afford to notice them properly. The dog moved at a pace that suggested she knew he was behind her and was allowing for it. Not waiting for him, allowing. The distinction was something Cole understood in his body without translating it. He had worked with military working dogs on 3 deployments. He knew the difference between a dog that was following instinct and a dog that was doing something it had considered. It took 40 minutes. Sable led him through the pasture, along the fence line, down through the hollow, and through the iron gate of the Calverton churchyard. The snow from the previous week had melted to a thin crust over the grass, and their footsteps broke it with each step. The churchyard was small, 30, maybe 40 graves, tilted stones going back to the 1800s, and at the far edge, newer ground disturbed by recent digging, not yet settled back to level. Sable walked to the grave. She stood on it, and she looked back at Cole. There was no headstone. There was a temporary marker, a white metal stake with a paper card in a plastic sleeve, the kind used when permanent installation has been deferred. The card said Rachel Ann Merritt, and a date of birth, and a date of death that was the same as the day Cole had been in a blackout communications window on the Balochistan border, and had not received the message that would have brought him home. Cole stood at the edge of the grave for a long time. He had survived 3 deployments, and a 4th that never got a name in any official record. He had survived the kind of silence that battlefield clearance produces, and the kind of darkness that follows when you've seen things you cannot talk about to people who weren't there. He had not survived this. He had not even begun to survive this yet. He was standing at his wife's unmarked grave in the November cold, because a dog had walked him there, and the dog was now standing on the grave looking at him. And Cole Merritt, who had not cried since he was 17 years old, sat down in the snow. He sat there for a long time. The cold worked through the seat of his jeans and the backs of his hands. He let it. The churchyard was very quiet. The kind of quiet that a tree line produces when the wind drops, all sound absorbed into the distance. Nothing close. He was aware of his own breathing. He was aware of the temporary marker and the word Rachel, and the dates, and the particular violence of seeing a whole life reduced to 2 numbers with a dash between them. 16 years of marriage, most of it conducted by satellite phone and letters, and the particular skill they'd both developed of saying what needed saying in the windows when it was possible, and holding the rest until later. Later had always been coming. It had always been ahead of them. The time when the deployments would slow down, and they would be in the same place for long enough to know what their ordinary life was supposed to look like. He had been 43 days from the end of his last contract. She had been 37 years old. Sable came to him eventually, stepped off the grave, walked to his side, pressed her weight against him, and stayed. The dog was warm beside him, and above them the November sky was the color of old pewter, and Cole said things to Rachel that had needed saying for 16 years of deployments and missions and missed birthdays and reassurances, that he'd come home. He always came home, and she had always said she knew. He hadn't come home in time. He said that too. He said it to the ground and the dog and the gray sky, and the dog pressed harder against his side, and Cole put his arm around her without thinking about it. She was warm and solid, and she did not move. He understood, sitting in the snow, why she came every morning. She was doing what she had been trained to do. She was providing the specific kind of presence that people who carry invisible weight cannot ask for, and sometimes cannot recognize when it arrives. She was doing it for Rachel. She was doing it now for him. He stayed until his hands had gone numb. Then he stood up, and they walked back. Back at the house, Cole called Preston Hale and did not leave a voicemail. He sat at the kitchen table, the table with 3 chairs, and he thought carefully, in the way he had been trained to think about things that required patience and sequence, and the identification of what needed to happen in what order. Then he called a Marine veteran he'd met at a transition assistance program in 2021, whose name was Garrett Nash, and who had become, in the years since, a veterans estate attorney in Richmond. He reached Garrett on the second ring. He gave Garrett the relevant facts without ornamentation. Rachel's death on November 4th. The burial arranged without Cole's knowledge or input. The estate, which included a property in Rappahannock County that had been in Rachel's family for 3 generations, and that Cole now understood Preston had been managing since before Rachel's death under a power of attorney Cole had never seen. The temporary marker at the grave because the permanent headstone order, which should have been initiated from Rachel's estate, had not been submitted. The missing chair. Garrett Nash listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, there was a 3-second pause. 3 things, Garrett said. First, the burial arrangements do not affect your legal standing as her husband. Second, the Rappahannock property is almost certainly part of Rachel's estate, and you are her primary beneficiary. Third, the power of attorney needs to be reviewed by an estate judge immediately, because if it was executed without proper documentation, or if it contains irregularities, and I'm betting it does, Preston Hale has a significant problem. Preston Hale did have a significant problem. The power of attorney he had obtained from Rachel 6 months before her death had been witnessed only by employees of his own law firm, which created a conflict of interest that Virginia estate law addressed clearly. The burial had been arranged without Cole's notification on a time frame that a judge later described as, in the written opinion, aggressively expedited in a manner inconsistent with notification requirements for a surviving spouse. The Rappahannock property had already been transferred to a holding company Preston had established 2 weeks after Rachel's death. Preston Hale was a man who had practiced estate law for 20 years and believed, with the particular confidence of someone who had operated in a system long enough to understand its tolerances, that what could be documented incorrectly could also be defended. He was not a man who thought of himself as doing something wrong. He had managed his sister's affairs because she needed managing and her husband was never there. And managing had gradually become controlling. And controlling had gradually become assuming that the decisions were his to make. He was wrong about the defendability, but he did not discover that until Garrett Nash filed the motion in January. He had a corner office in a building with his name in the directory, and he sat in that office making decisions about other people's property with the comfortable authority of a man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't manage. He had the bearing of someone who had never once considered that impunity might end. The easy authority of someone who signed documents in expensive offices and was addressed by colleagues as counselor, and who had arranged his younger sister's burial on his own terms without any particular concern for the man she'd married. Because he had decided, at some point in the years of his sister's marriage to a man who was always away, that the marriage was not the primary fact about Rachel. Preston Hale lost the Rappahannock property in March. He lost the legal battle over the estate in stages that were humiliating in their specificity, because Garrett Nash was the kind of attorney who leaves nothing unchallenged and documents everything. The Virginia State Bar opened an inquiry into the conflict of interest in the witnessing of the power of attorney. Preston's license was not suspended. It was placed under conditions that made it effectively impossible to practice the kind of estate law he had built his career on. A mutual colleague told someone who told Cole that Preston had quietly left Charlottesville by summer. Cole arranged for the headstone himself. He chose the inscription and the stone and drove to Calverton to oversee the installation on a clear April morning. The permanent stone was gray granite with a simple inscription: Rachel's name, her dates, and the words she had put on a sticky note on Cole's bathroom mirror the morning he left for his 4th deployment, and which he'd memorized before he peeled it off and kept in his wallet for the 14 months he was gone. Come home whole. He had not entirely. But he had come home, and he was working on it. On the first Sunday of every month, Cole drove to Calverton and walked through the iron gate with Sable beside him. The churchyard in spring was a different place from the churchyard in November. The light came through the trees at a different angle, and the grass was green, and the graves had lost their frozen severity. Sable would walk to Rachel's stone and stand there for a while, as she had always stood, and then she would turn and come back to Cole's side and sit down. Sometimes they stayed an hour, sometimes longer. He had begun to know the other graves. There was a veteran from the Second World War in the north corner, a man named Ellis who'd served in the Pacific, and Cole had started leaving a small stone on the marker when he visited the way he'd learned you do at the graves of soldiers. A stone that means someone was here. Someone remembered. There were families going back to the 1820s, names that recurred across the generations, the way names do in the kind of place where people stay. Rachel had always wanted to stay somewhere long enough for the name to mean something. She'd found the place. He was still catching up to it. The neighbor, Margaret Calloway, had brought flowers once, without being asked, and left them by the gate, and Cole had found them when he arrived, and stood looking at them for a moment before he brought them to the stone. He thanked her later. She said there was no need. The house had 4 chairs at the kitchen table again. Cole had found the estate sale chair at a consignment shop in Harrisonburg in February. Not the same chair, a different one, but the same era, the same weight. He'd placed it at the table in the same position Rachel had kept hers, and he'd sat at the table with his coffee and looked at it. And it was not the same, and it was not nothing. Sable slept at the foot of his bed. She woke him when the nightmare started, not by barking, but by climbing up beside him and pressing her weight against his side, which was what she had been trained to do. The first time it happened, Cole had been so surprised by it that he'd woken up from that instead of from the dream. And he'd lain there in the dark with 74 pounds of warm dog pressed against him, and he'd thought about Rachel choosing her, training with her, learning what the dog's specific kind of presence was for. He thought about Rachel choosing it for herself, and then leaving it for him. The dog had known what he needed before he knew he needed it. She had known it for 3 weeks in November before he was even home. She had walked 2 miles through the snow every morning to a grave he didn't know existed, to stand over the woman she loved, and when he finally arrived, she had walked him there herself. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive on 4 legs, early in the morning, moving through the snow with a sense of purpose that requires no explanation and no translation. We have a tendency to believe that loyalty is a human quality, that it is something we choose, something we earn, something we can decide to extend or withhold. Dogs know something different. They know that loyalty is not a decision. It is a nature. It is the thing that makes a German Shepherd walk 2 miles through November snow to stand on a grave, not because she has been commanded to, not because she was trained for it, not because anyone is watching, but because she has not forgotten. Because she will not forget. Because the love of a dog for the person it was given to does not end at the grave, and it does not end in the cold, and it does not end. God gave us animals who love us better than we deserve and grieve alongside us with a faithfulness we rarely manage ourselves. If Rachel's dog could hold vigil in the snow, day after day, waiting for a man she'd never met to come home and sit in the cold beside her, then perhaps the question is not whether we are loved past the point of loss. Perhaps the question is only whether we are paying attention when the love finds us. If this story touched something in you, Please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe that loyalty and love do not end at the edge of a snowfield, please subscribe so you never miss the next story we tell. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you, even on the coldest mornings, even when you cannot find your way back, that something is waiting at the grave. Something that will not leave until you come home.